Hello world, this is Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor. And in this short screencast, we're going to continue our Coding Bootcamp 101 series so you know what you need to know before spending 10 grand or more on a coding bootcamp. The goal of this video is to provide a logical, affordable, and effective way to attack the 5 areas of the full stack. And if you've been watching my series, you know that I define the full stack as 2 big major pieces, the front end with the 3 common technologies, HTML, hypertext markup language to markup your content, CSS to style and lay out your content, JavaScript to provide interactivity. And then on the back end, which is where we're about ready to go, we're going to talk about the server-side languages and the databases. Putting that all together, we get the full stack. I have a definite idea on how you should learn the full stack. I believe it's imperative that you learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript first. You're going to need it at some point in your life, and it is just a rewarding way to get started with your full stack web app education. At that point, I encourage you to go into the database and server-side language, and that's what we're going to talk about in this screencast. So now we're starting to get into some interesting terminology because the stack can mean different things to different people. In this series of screencasts, I've defined the full stack as someone who knows both the front end and the back end technologies. In other words, they can do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They can also do the back-end database and server-side language pieces of a web app. However, the stack to others sometimes means something slightly different. One of the first stacks that we discussed in computer science was the LAMP stack. It's still an extremely common stack, and it consisted of L for Linux, A for Apache, M for MySQL, and P for PHP. And Linux and Apache are in black here because they're really not developers' tools. Rather, they're on the infrastructure side of things. Linux is the server-side operating system, and Apache, which is the server-side HTTP web server. So those 2 pieces make up your web server. The M for MySQL is the database that's located on the server, and PHP also is a server-side language that runs, it's compiled on the server. Now, you still needed your front-end technologies of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to make a web app in this world. However, that stack did not include the front-end technologies. They were simply assumed. Another very common stack that people are discussing right now is the mean stack. That is a pure JavaScript stack for building full-stack web applications. The MEAN stand for MongoDB at the database end, E for Express.js, which is a backend framework for Node.js, AngularJS, which is a front-end framework for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and Node.js, which is actually JavaScript used on the server. Now, JavaScript traditionally, as you know, going through these screencasts, is a front-end language. But of course, people, once they learned JavaScript and the eloquence of it, wanted to use it on the server side as well, and that's what Node.js gives us. It's a JavaScript language that's been extended to the back end. So the mean stack is getting a lot of buzz right now. Yet another stack is the Microsoft WISA stack, and W stands for Windows on the server side. This would not be Windows on our local machines, but rather the server side version of Windows. The I is for Internet Information Services. That's our web server piece that runs on that server. The S is for SQL Server, which is Microsoft's proprietary database. And the A was for ASP.NET, which is a front-end/back-end framework that uses C# as the programming language on the back end. And once again, the front-end technologies of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are assumed in the Microsoft stack. Now, there are many other stacks, and if you go to Wikipedia and you search for solution stack, you will see the many different stacks that are available. Many of them are versions of the LAMP stack, which was one of the first and most common stacks available. However, I bring all this up so that you're aware that the full stack, as I've defined it in this screencast, is conceptual. And when people say stack, they're using a software stack, you really need to stop them and ask them, what are the pieces of the stack that you're referring to? As we've been talking about stacks, we're also starting to talk about frameworks. Frameworks are an incredibly important way to help you stay organized. And one definition of a framework is a standard way to build and deploy applications. So typically, frameworks are not new languages. They're simply a set of rules. Frameworks have different functions and features depending upon the framework. But in general, the framework is not a new language. However, it's a set of rules by which you approach your programming language. For example, ASP.NET is a framework for the C# language. Within ASP.NET, we do our programming in C#. However, ASP.NET helps us keep our files, folders, variable names all organized so that if I build an application and I use C#, someone behind me could easily come in behind me and maintain that application because I'm using a framework that requires me to use a set of rules, a set of common constructs that the next programmer is going to understand. That's the Microsoft framework, ASP.NET. You can use both Visual Basic as well as C# language with that framework. And if you use that framework, the most common database that you would use is SQL Server because that's Microsoft's database. If you're programming in Ruby, no doubt your framework will be Rails. Ruby is a wonderful language, but it really never became popular until Rails gave it some structure and gave it some muscle and gave it some organization as a framework. The most popular database used with Ruby on Rails is PostgreSQL. Similarly, if you're programming in Python, you'll probably be using this framework. And the database that's commonly used with Python is MySQL. Those are open source technologies, unlike C#, ASP.NET, and SQL Server, which are Microsoft technologies. All the rest of these are pretty much open source technologies. For PHP, which is the most popular backend programming language, and that's the one I'd recommend that you learn first when you go to the server side. There are many different popular, robust frameworks. WordPress is a framework. Some people call it a CMS, a content management system, because it goes so much further beyond just organizing your code. However, you can think of it as a framework for developing your web application. But behind the scenes, behind that WordPress interface, PHP is doing the heavy lifting of moving the content around and organizing it. Other popular frameworks for PHP include Drupal, Laravel, and Joomla, and it also uses, most commonly, the MySQL backend database. Node.js, if you choose that, it's a JavaScript server-side language library, uses Express as its framework. And its most common database is MongoDB, which is a NoSQL model. And I'll talk about these databases and the difference between a relational database model and a NoSQL model in the next screencast. This word framework is incredibly important, and here are your most common frameworks that organize the server-side language that you choose. Frameworks are almost essential on the back end to help keep your code organized. However, are there frameworks on the front end as well? Absolutely. Now we know that the front end languages are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So all of these frameworks on the front end organize those same three languages. You've probably heard of Bootstrap. It is by far the most popular front end framework right now, but there are several others that are really excellent as well, and even more than this list that are coming on strong. And at this point in time, you might be asking, well, what about jQuery? Where does jQuery fit? Well, jQuery is simply a collection of JavaScript files. As such, it's called a JavaScript library. The library is simply a collection of files that extend the language. So jQuery can do some real cool transitions and movements and effects on your web page that the pure JavaScript language cannot. But suffice to say, the word framework and libraries overlap. People will use those terms synonymously, even though a library is typically just a collection of files. The full stack developer really boils down to 5 key areas. The first 3 on the front end, the last 2 are on the back end. There are so many variations when we get to the back end. There are so many different choices for databases as well as server-side languages. And as soon as we get into server-side languages, there's a framework available for each one. So that's where the acronyms start flying and things can get confusing quickly. Would I encourage you to use a framework? Yes. Would I encourage you to use libraries? Absolutely. And should you stick with technologies that are in a common stack? Absolutely. But before you go into frameworks, before you go into jQuery, please learn those basic languages first. Things will make so much more sense to you if you know the basics, these 5 basics. Thank you.